When the kings of Saudi Arabia brandish their swords, the powerful figures in this world join in their dance, the dance of the sword. The dance that celebrates the reign of the sword clan and the almighty power of their kingdom. Saudi Arabia is the Western world's strongest ally in the Middle East. It is the largest exporter of oil in the world. It plays guardian to the holy sites of Islam. It is an indispensable partner. But as the number of attacks continues to increase in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Tunisia, Brussels and Paris, some are starting to wonder, is there a link with Saudi Arabia? Throughout the world and for many decades, the kingdom has been spreading the most radical version of Islam, Wahhabism. This is also known as the Salafi movement, a branch of Islam that has also been adopted by Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Is Saudi Arabia playing both sides? By allying with such a country, is the West putting itself in danger? The answers to these questions can be found at the heart of the Saudi kingdom, in the inner workings of the government, in the speeches given by its religious representatives, in this enclosed country where Westerners are rarely welcome. This is Prince Bandar's palace. He is a member of the Saud family. This family gave its name to the kingdom. In total, there are 5,000 or maybe even 10,000 princes. This is the living room where Prince Bandar receives his guests.
يا مشايخ ويا شعب سعودي انتم تراجعونا وتقولون لكم أغراض ولكم لوازم ولكم شيء. بيباننا مفتوحة، تلفون موجود، الكتاب موجود. احنا نرحب أي إنسان له مشكلة نحلها إذا قدرنا.
The prince opens the doors to his palace every day during mealtimes. The local community, therefore, have the honor of entering the room and eating at his table. Those who can will try to gain favors and make little arrangements. This is how the reigning body works. Saudi Arabia is not a democracy. Political parties are forbidden. The people do not have a voice on matters. But as long as the royal family continues to distribute the country's huge wealth, the system stays in place.
The regime is an authoritarian regime, there's no question about that. But it doesn't need to resort to the brutal tactics of, let's say, the regime of Saddam in Iraq or the regime of Assad in Syria. The state is a very powerful state and it has, very good policing and intelligence services.
Every phone in Saudi Arabia is tapped. They have multiple kinds of police, but you don't feel that oppression of the police everywhere around. But believe me, if the authorities come to the conclusion that you're a subversive element or engaged in actions against the interests of the monarchy, you'll discover it's a police state.
The Sauds do not need to flex their muscles because they have established a system that is unique in the world. The princes share the power with a radical religious faction, the Wahhabi. When the Western world allies itself with the Sauds, it's also allying itself with Wahhabism. A branch of Islam that the Muslim world rejected since it first emerged in the 18th century. To all other schools of Islam, it is a dangerous faction. At the start of the 20th century, the Wahhabi were confined to a portion of the Arab desert controlled by the Saud clan. They decided to join forces, the sword of the Sauds, the ruling Islam of the Wahhabi. At the end of the First World War, the British became the biggest colonial power in the region. This portion of desert was of no interest to them. Petrol had not yet been discovered there. While the Sauds and the Wahhabi left the British territories alone, they were able to pursue conquests elsewhere, in the name of God.
Alors c'est un djihad, c'est formulé comme tel. Hein. Les musulmans qui ne partagent pas leur conception de la religion sont des mécréants, et donc il est légitime de déclarer le djihad contre eux, c'est-à-dire de les combattre au nom de l'islam pour étendre le territoire de l'Arabie saoudite, c'est-à-dire, selon cette logique, étendre le territoire de l'islam, puisqu'ils considèrent d'une certaine manière qu'ils sont les seuls musulmans.
But the chief of the clan, Ibn Saud, lost control of his fanatic warriors. They began attacking territories held by the British. Ibn Saud had to bring them down. He did so with the help of the English. That marked the first strategic allegiance between the Sauds and the West. Ibn Saud stopped the jihad, and the Wahhabi accepted it. In 1932, Saudi Arabia became a kingdom, and so they were able to apply their version of Islam throughout their vast land. The ulamas, the religious authorities, would always defend the power of the Sauds.
Les oulémas saoudiens, depuis les origines, ont produit toute une littérature qu'on pourrait qualifier de littérature de l'obéissance. Quel que soit leur comportement, même si le comportement est injuste, même si la distribution des richesses paraît injuste, ils incitent tout le temps la population à obéir aveuglément aux gouvernants.
The Sauds entrusted the management of society to the ulamas. Education, justice and media were in the hands of the religious. Abdelaziz al-Fawzan is one of the most highly respected ulamas in the kingdom. Each week, he dictates how Saudis should behave, right down to the finest details on a daily basis.
مرحبا أستاذ خالد حياك الله.
لو تكرمت يا شيخ أحب أستفسر عن التأمين للعائلات اللي هو التأمين الطبي اللي هو بالنسبة يعني أبغى أستفسر عن نفس شركة التأمين بوبة الطبية أو التعاونية، هل هي جائزة أم لا؟
وكل العلماء مسؤوليتهم كبيرة جدا، لأن الناس يحتاجونهم في عباداتهم، كيف يصلي، كيف يزكي، كيف يحج، كيف يتم الزواج مثلا، كيف تكون المعاملة بين الزوجين، كيف تكون مع الأولاد، كيف تحل خلافاتهم إذا حصل بينهم خلافات سواء على مستوى العائلة أو مستوى المجتمع.
The Wahhabi apply Islam as it was in the time of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. For them, Islam is just a long list of rules. The law is Sharia law. The punishments prescribed in the Quran are followed to the letter: maiming, execution by the sword, and sometimes even in public arenas. In restaurants and shops, areas are strictly separated. Women and families on one side and single men on the other. The religious police keep watch over this.
I think when they started in the 50s or the 60s, the idea is to follow some verses in Quran that's saying that everybody has to be responsible for the good of the society, and they will come and say it's the time for prayer, please go to prayer, and that's it. It is now just a government institution interfering in other people's life, harassing people all around in public places, men and women. It's not only women.
I think the people there suffer because of it. And you can see this because they're always exchanging emails and phone numbers and taking pictures of each other. And so, I mean, you know, young people cannot meet. You don't have cinemas. You don't have places where people can just gather together.
Thanks to the Wahhabi ulamas, the royal family is able to keep its 30 million strong population under control. In exchange, the king is committed to spreading their vision of Islam.
نريد أن نطهر ما ينسب للإسلام من بدع ومن خرافات وشركيات نسبت للإسلام زورا وبهتانا، بل هي تهدم الإسلام أحيانا من أساسه. المسلم يتبع منهج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، وهذا هو الإسلام الحق، وما خالفه فهو منحرف عن الإسلام الصحيح.
Purifying Islam, eliminating the sects, whether they're Shiites, Sufis, Malachites, all branches of Islam are targets. For almost a century, this project caused no problems for the Western world. All it saw in Saudi Arabia were the huge oil reserves, which it had to get its hands on. In 1945, as the Second World War came to an end, the American President Franklin Roosevelt sealed a deal with Ibn Saud, Saudi oil, in exchange for the United States' protection of not only the kingdom, but the Saud family too. At the very start of the Cold War, Saudi Arabia was tightly linked to the West. This allegiance grew stronger very quickly when Saudi Arabia and the Western world discovered they had a common enemy, Nasser, the president of Egypt. He chose to align himself with the USSR. He threatened American, French and British interests in the Middle East. But Nasser also posed a threat to Saudi Arabia. He was secular and Republican and rallied crowds throughout the region.
أيها الإخوة فعلا أيها الإخوة الشعب العربي شعب واحد والجيش العربي جيش واحد ولن يفرق بيننا الاستعمار أو أعوان الاستعمار. لقد خلقت هذه الأمة أمة عربية واحدة.
This call for unity between Arab populations is what Nasser referred to as pan-Arabism. His influence spread. But the backlash would come from Saudi Arabia. The kingdom rebuffed Nasser's secular ideas with Islamic values. Saudi Arabia called for unity between all Muslims, thus marking the start of pan-Islamism. For the West, this only served as an advantage.
Saudi Arabia essentially wants to be the leader of the Muslim world. And if it can bring the Muslims together in some sort of a single unified community, then it can exercise tremendous power.
In order to do so, Saudi Arabia formed the Muslim World League, which oversees hundreds of charity organizations. They took action within the Muslim world. The kingdom began accepting foreign students, 45,000 of which came to study religion in Saudi universities. For the Western world, Saudi Arabia's growing influence was a way of fighting against Nasser's nationalism. But the machine that established itself and prospered on oil revenues predominantly favored the interests of religious Saudis. It enabled them to keep spreading Wahhabism, which was better known beyond the Saudi borders as the Salafi movement.
That enormous expansion of Saudi wealth led to the expansion of an empire of Saudi-funded mosques, universities, madrasas, hospitals, all kinds of things, all of which pushed the Saudi version of Islam. And they outbid all of their competitors.
Saudi Arabia financed construction, renovation and management costs for mosques all around the world, especially places lacking in funding for mosques, places where Muslim communities were in the minority. Large mosques in capital cities, but also a myriad of smaller mosques in remote villages. It was impossible to list them all. Saudi Arabia also held an influence in Europe, where most countries do not accommodate the cost of financing the Muslim cult.
In 1975, the Saudis took over the largest mosque in Belgium. They then poured millions of dollars into making it the center of Islamic prayer in the heart of the capital of Europe. Was that an evil plan from the beginning to produce the kind of jihadists who attacked the city of Paris? No. Did it have some bearing on the fact that 30, 40 years later, parts of Brussels are known as jihadist ghettos? Yes, it did, because that money helped to create an environment in which an intolerant form of Islam became very, very strong.
Saudi Islam had made its mark everywhere, but it's here that it was at its most visible, at the heart of the kingdom. This is what was to become Mecca. 2 million believers come here in pilgrimage every year. Today, only Wahhabism can be preached here. In the Great Mosque, buildings devoted to other schools of Islam have been destroyed. In addition to this, the house of the Prophet and that of his companions were destroyed. Over the years, more than 90% of historic buildings have disappeared. For the Wahhabi, neither monuments nor people should be worshipped. One must only worship God.
Now think of this. If, for example, the Israelis demolished a mosque, say that mosque was 200 years old, there will be demonstrations throughout the Muslim world. Buses will be burnt in Karachi, American embassy will be attacked in Jakarta, they'll be out on the streets, in the streets of Cairo and Amman. Yet, the Saudis have been performing the most violent destruction of the most holiest city in Islam for the last 50 years, and there's hardly been a single demonstration.
The Saudi Arabian desire for power exploded into the world view in 1973. Israel had just inflicted another humiliating defeat on the Arab armies. Saudi Arabia had financed these armies and supported the Palestinian cause, but that no longer sufficed. This time, it would use its most formidable weapon. Along with the other oil-producing Arab states, it imposed an embargo on all countries supporting Israel. Oil prices skyrocketed.
No other country since World War II has ever done anything so economically devastating to the United States as Saudi Arabia did in 1973.
Soon after the embargo was imposed, a message came from the CIA representative in Saudi Arabia. Of course, whoever read the message got the message very clearly, which was a threat.
The United States tried to take control of Saudi oil wells. The pact between the two countries shattered into pieces. The balance of powers was reversed.
Do you believe that now, in the modern world, that we have come to depend on you more than you have on us?
Well, you have come to depend on us, this is true. But we are not arrogant. We don't think that we don't depend on you. It's a small world. You are powerful. You own all kinds of technology. And we are in the very beginning. And we want to cooperate with you.
A compromise was reached. Saudi Arabia lifted the embargo. The United States reviewed their position on Israel.
The consequence was that the United States, ever since 1973, has been engaged in trying to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. Not with much success, but the Saudis certainly got our attention.
This was a political victory for Saudi Arabia. Until that point, no Muslim or Arab country had managed to force the United States to make concessions. But it was also an economic victory. Within the space of a few days, the country's revenues quadrupled. The Sauds progressively bought out Aramco, the American company exploiting their oil. The country entered into the consumer era. It transformed itself. What happened back then would seem unimaginable today.
المملكة العربية السعودية في جدة نقدم لكم الآن بعض الموسيقى العربية ونبدأ بأغنية سعودية من المطربة ابتسام لطفي واسم الأغنية وداعاً.
Vous avez quand même un certain nombre de choses qui vont arriver en Arabie Saoudite dans les années 60 et 70 qui vont heurter les segments les plus conservateurs de la société. En particulier, vous avez des cinémas à l'époque. Vous avez des marchands, par exemple, qui ont des mannequins féminins. pour exposer les vêtements pour femmes, qui aussi ont il y a des publicités dans la rue, publicités qui vont être importées souvent d'Occident et transposées telles quelles dans le contexte saoudien. Et ça va provoquer aussi les réactions d'une partie du segment le plus conservateur de la société, qui va y voir le début d'une dénaturation du pays, se disant finalement, voilà, c'est une menace contre l'islam saoudien.
Can I ask you, first of all, what do you want to do when you're qualified, when you leave the school perhaps and go to university?
I want to go to the university in any country I can go.
And what about you?
I'm going to America. I want to be a social worker.
When you're qualified, do you want to come back to Saudi Arabia?
Of course, yes.
How do you feel about talking to us without your veil? Do you prefer to be seen with a veil or without one?
No, I prefer without.
This brief interlude of freedom came to an end on the morning of the 20th of November 1979. 100 armed men took some religious believers hostage in the Great Mosque in Mecca. Unable to subdue the rebels, the authorities began to falter. An elite French unit was called in for backup. In order to crush the rebels, the unit sprayed nerve gas, even into underground basements. The hostage situation lasted 18 days. Saudi Arabia then learned the identities of these rebels. Most of them were Saudis, raised in the purest of Wahhabi traditions. For them, the royal family had corrupted society and betrayed the precepts of Wahhabism. These men would be executed. But the royal family had heard their message. Cinemas were shut. The religious police's hold over the people was strengthened. The authorities locked everything down. They would never forget that turning away from the strictest form of Wahhabism would risk their own collapse from power.
The government can turn on or off. It's like a dial, it's a volume dial of how religious, how controlled the public space should be. And how it decides when to turn it up or when to turn it down is complicated to explain, because sometimes it's to do with some challenge from a domestic group, or sometimes they're trying to please the West to show that they're open and they're tolerant. So it's a very complicated game.
The authorities also knew that they could not keep the entire country under such a lead blanket without providing a few spaces of freedom. Like here, a few kilometers from Riyadh, on the 1st June as you exit the city. Hundreds of men come and hang out here each weekend. They launch their four-wheel drives onto the sand and let rip. For a few moments, they forget the rules that suffocate them on a daily basis. This form of outlet is called duning. Will this tiny space of freedom be enough for Saudis for much longer? Saudi Arabia is no longer a desert area cut off from the world. Its 30 million inhabitants are highly connected to the internet. Fahad Boutairi is the first Saudi Arabian YouTuber. He has 2.5 million followers on Twitter. Many others have followed in his footsteps. The start of the movement on social media networks has thus far been tolerated by the authorities. He addresses issues within society, much like in this parody, which acts as a reminder that women still do not have the right to drive in Saudi Arabia.
No woman, no drive. No woman, no drive. Say I remember when you used to sit in the family car, but backseat. Over is so safe and well, so you can make lots and lots of babies.
I'm optimistic about the fact that the majority of the population is younger than 30. Changes that have been seen as, I guess, vile or evil or westernizing in the past might be seen as progressive nowadays. So this young population will definitely drive more change in the future. That's what I'm optimistic about in general.
Saudis are very active and very engaged in social media. Now, it's true that they haven't been engaged in that way in the public square without government monitoring and supervision. And that's by design. Government doesn't want its population to be organized. It wants it to be atomized because it can better control it.
Nobody can dispute the authority of the Saud clan. When the West asks them for open-mindedness, the princes simply say that society isn't ready, that it's conservative. But really, the Sauds refuse any change as a way of protecting their power.
We are a society built in, obeys to follow whatever the king say. So no change will happen unless the king gives the decrees for this change. And the society, the conservative and the liberal, will follow the steps of the decree. Maybe tomorrow morning we'll wake up and have a decree, or I will wake up 20 years from now and nothing changed.
We're not going to have the kind of radical reform that perhaps people in the West would like to see. It's going to be incremental. It's going to be very small pieces. And yes, you don't become king of Saudi Arabia to become Queen Elizabeth. Saudis say that all the time. You want to be king of Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarch.
The West understands its place. It knows that democracy is a long shot. A change in power in the government of the world's largest exporter of oil could upset the wider economic and regional situation. The world already observed this scenario in 1979. Iran, a loyal ally to the United States and second largest exporter of oil, began to switch. The Shah of Iran, an authoritarian monarch, was overthrown. Ayatollah Khomeini established an Islamic republic. He turned against the United States and France, but his regime wasn't just anti-West, it was also republican and revolutionary. Khomeini quickly began calling Muslims to overthrow the monarchies in the surrounding region.
La famille saoudienne et l'Arabie saoudite va se sentir en danger, menacée, puisqu'à l'époque, effectivement, la volonté de l'Iran, c'est d'exporter sa révolution islamique. C'est le message révolutionnaire qu'ils veulent répandre, et c'est ce qui tétanise, bien sûr, l'Arabie saoudite.
In order to stifle Iran's influence, Saudi Arabia created a deep divide within the Muslim world. A divide that can still be found at the heart of all conflicts in the Middle East. It stirs hatred between Sunnis and Shiites. The Shiites represent the majority in Iran, yet Saudi Arabia will never cease treating them as fake Muslims.
En mettant le curseur sur chiites, sunnites, l'Arabie saoudite sait parfaitement que cette exportation de la révolution, elle ne peut pas s'exporter, puisque l'environnement, il est quand même très majoritairement sunnite. Donc les dirigeants saoudiens utilisent complètement volontairement ce message confessionnel pour discréditer et puis dire de toute façon, votre révolution, l'expansion de votre révolution est vouée à l'échec.
Saddam Hussein saw this as a great opportunity. The Iraqi president wanted to get his hands on Iran. In 1980, he declared war on the country. The West provided him with the arms. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies footed the bill. Never had Western and Saudi interests been so closely knit as they were at the beginning of the 80s. These connections tightened even further over Afghanistan. The Soviets occupied the country and established a communist rule. They were at the gateway to the Middle East. Once again, Saudi Arabia provided a fearsome ideological weapon. It revived jihad, which had been dormant for 20 years, and established a kingdom. There was no religious connection for Saudi Arabia. It was above all their response to a major geopolitical crisis. It was also another way to send the most radical Saudis thousands of kilometers away from the kingdom.
Le prince Sultan, qui est alors ministre de la Défense, déclare que pour tout Saoudien qui partira combattre en Afghanistan, il paiera 75% du billet d'avion de sa poche. C'est quand même le ministre de la Défense qui dit ça. Donc il y a un soutien à ceux qui partent combattre en Afghanistan qui est un soutien absolument officiel.
Alongside the CIA, Saudi leaders sent millions of dollars to Afghan fighters. The Afghan cause was now attracting Muslims from around the world. Faced with a huge surge in volunteers, they had to have a sorting system. They'd filter out those who would be useful in combat. 3 men were in charge of this mission.
Abdullah Azzam and Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri decided to establish a hosting organization in Peshawar to receive the volunteers who came from all over the world and wanted to help the Mujahideen. And they called this grouping at that time Al-Qaeda, meaning the base.
The Sauds therefore successfully managed to make themselves the best ally to the West and the first in line for the radical Islamist movement. In 1989, the USSR withdrew from Afghanistan. The Soviet Empire collapsed 2 years later. Iran emerged thoroughly eroded from 8 years of war against Iraq. It was no longer a threat to the kingdom. A new world order seemed to be taking shape, in which the West and its Saudi ally were the great victors. But everything shifted in 1990. Saddam Hussein was drowning in debt after waging war against Iran. His main creditors, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, refused to wipe them out. The Iraqi dictator resorted to an act of force. He invaded Kuwait. The royal family panicked. Saudi Arabia could be his next target.
أنه كل الإعلام السعودي استمر 4 أيام يتجاهل وجود غزو عراقي للكويت، والمواطن السعودي يستمع إلى أخبار حدوده الشمالية من خلال الإذاعات الأجنبية. كان فشل مروع للدولة.
Osama bin Laden raced to the kingdom's rescue. Having returned from Afghanistan a hero, he promised to gather thousands of jihadi fighters to protect Saudi Arabia from an Iraqi invasion.
He was told, thank you very much, but basically, don't call us, we'll call you. And I think that was, to him, a huge disappointment. And he felt slighted and insulted by this response from Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia didn't need jihadis. What it needed was a global coalition, the biggest of all time. A total of 34 allied countries. But tempers were flaring up in the kingdom. Atheist soldiers had set foot on the holy sites. To the Islamist movement, this was an affront.
أنه إلى هذا الحد سكتنا وتغافلنا عن الفشل الكبير في تأسيس الدولة وحماية ثرواتها وتأسيس جيش كبير وكافي، لكن أشعر أن شيئا ما لا بد من فعله.
Et on va voir pendant des années, en vérité, de 90 jusqu'à 94-95, les mosquées saoudiennes devenir le lieu d'une contestation ouverte contre le pouvoir saoudien, avec des prêcheurs extrêmement populaires qui ne mâchent pas leurs mots. Il y en a qui vont à un moment appeler à manifester. En Arabie saoudite, c'est quelque chose de complètement inédit qu'on appelle à manifester.
Hundreds of Islamists were imprisoned. Osama bin Laden was forbidden from entering the country. He found refuge in Sudan and then returned to Afghanistan. But indignation and anger had already spread throughout the region. Saudi Arabia was fighting an Arab country with help from the West. The image was disastrous. This provoked a divide between Saudi Arabia and part of the Islamist movement. For the most radical believers, the Saudi leaders were traitors who'd sold themselves out to the West.
I think the Gulf War reinforced the message of jihadis that the West was invading the Arabian Peninsula, and that the West, not just the United States, but France, Great Britain, others, wanted to take control of the oil resources of the Middle East. In that sense, it was a validation, if you like, of the jihadist argument.
other building, that's terrorists! Other building? That's terrorists, bro! That's fucking terrorists! Oh my God. That's terrorists, bro. They just shot another, did you get that? I zoomed out on it.
15 of the 19 terrorists from September the 11th, 2001 were of Saudi Arabian nationality, just like the commander behind the attacks, Osama bin Laden.
Well, I think the choice of 15 hijackers and 9/11 being from Saudi Arabia was a deliberate choice made by Osama bin Laden. I think he wanted to create a rift between the Saudi leadership and the United States. My sense is that he wanted to create an embarrassing situation for the Saudis, and he was able to accomplish that. Were the Saudis responsible for 9/11? Absolutely not. I mean, the Saudi leadership was not responsible for 9/11. They were not behind the attackers of 9/11. The group that funded and organized 9/11 were enemies of Saudi Arabia and wanted to destroy Saudi Arabia, at least the rule of the Saudi dynasty.
But the world discovered, astounded, the extent of the network formed by the kingdom and its charitable organizations. Funded by money from the princes and rich businessmen and the money collected in mosques.
They supported Bosnians, they supported Palestinians, they supported Kosovo, they supported Chechnya. They have a long history of private money flowing to Islamic causes. Now, some of those Islamic causes have turned into Islamic terrorist organizations.
Several organizations directly supported by the royal family had the finger pointed at them by the American authorities, such as Al-Haramain, based in Saudi Arabia. It presents itself as a humanitarian organization that promotes education. 13 of its foreign branches were placed on the United Nations list of organizations linked to Al-Qaeda. Saudi Arabia did not deny this. It promised to shut down the incriminated organizations, and that was enough to quell the attacks from Washington. Osama bin Laden's strategy had failed. September the 11th did not push Saudi Arabia and the United States to breaking point.
Tonight we are a country awakened to danger and called to defend freedom.
George Bush's response was the war on terror. His first target was the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. As for Osama bin Laden, he hadn't yet finished with the Saudi regime. He wanted it to collapse. 2 years after 9/11, he ordered a series of attacks in the kingdom. More than 20 attacks in a space of 3 years. It came as a huge shock. The Saudi response was unequivocal.
C'est une guerre, hein, c'est vraiment... on fait la guerre aux groupes terroristes. Hein, c'est parce que vous avez un certain nombre de commissariats, d'unités de l'armée, etc., qui sont quand même touchés par ces attentats. Hein, donc le royaume est en guerre contre ces groupes terroristes.
So there was a period of much self-questioning in the kingdom. And so the kingdom looked into whether it was preachers in mosques, or educational material, or media coverage, etc. Our religious leadership here, the Higher Council of Ulama, came out with fatwas denouncing the use of terrorism in any form.
After 2003, any reference to jihad was punished. Ulamas who crossed the red line were arrested. The religious establishment reviewed its position. It remained Salafist and radical, but rid itself of any notion of jihad.
The Saudis do fight al-Qaeda. The last 2 al-Qaeda plots to attack the American homeland were foiled due to Saudi intelligence.
After the Saudi changeover in 2003, it began cooperating with the West in terms of intelligence. This could have been an effective response to jihadism. But nothing would stop George Bush's war on terror. In 2003, he declared war on Iraq. Unity with the West broke down.
Nous devons prendre la mesure de l'impact qu'aurait sur ce plan une action militaire contestée actuellement. Une telle intervention ne risquerait-elle pas d'aggraver les fractures entre les sociétés, entre les cultures, entre les peuples, fractures dont se nourrit le terrorisme?
France and Germany both sat in the non-conflict camp. Saudi Arabia joined them. It knew that catastrophe was lurking at its borders. but President Bush kept moving forward. He took down Saddam Hussein. The United States reversed the balance of power in Iraq. The country had, until then, been ruled by a Sunni regime. It was now in the hands of the Shiite Authority. For the Saudis, Iraq was now under Iranian influence. Saudi Arabia saw a Shiite arc form at its borders. Iran, Iraq, Syria, where Bashar al-Assad was an ally with Iran, much like the Hezbollah party in Lebanon. Saudi Arabia felt surrounded. More than ever, the kingdom found itself on the defensive, but nothing prepared it for what was to happen in the spring of 2011. The Arab youth took to the streets, and the dictators fell. France finally abandoned the Tunisian president Ben Ali, as well as the Egyptian Hosni Mubarak, which the United States watched fall without reacting. An ally of 30 years. It was traumatic for the Sauds. Were they the next in line? Abandoned in turn by the West. Saudi Arabia feared the spread of revolt. It did everything it could to stifle revolutions, until the Syrians revolted instead. It was the only revolution that Saudi Arabia encouraged. They wanted rid of Bashar al-Assad. He was an ally with Iran. Should he fall, the Shiite regime would shatter. In 2013, the kingdom hoped it could count on its Western allies. Washington, London and Paris were about to instigate military intervention in Syria. At the end of August, chemical weapons killed 1,300 people in the suburbs of Damascus. According to the secret services in the West, Bashar al-Assad was responsible for this massacre. He'd crossed the red line laid down by Washington, but at the last minute, the United States decided against intervening.
L'administration Obama fait le constat, à juste titre, que les interventions américaines ont totalement échoué, que ça a été un fiasco en Afghanistan, en Irak, et qu'il y a une war fatigue en ce qui concerne les États-Unis au Moyen-Orient. Ils ne veulent plus s'engager dans les conflits. Alors, c'est vrai qu'en Arabie Saoudite, ce désengagement est vécu comme pratiquement encore plus dangereux que le surinterventionnisme américain des années Bush.
President Obama had a better appreciation than most for the contradictions in this alliance. That Saudi Arabia is the source of the intolerance in the Sunni world that helps to foster the creation of Al-Qaeda and groups like it.
The American strategy in the Middle East changed, and this became clear to Saudi Arabia a few weeks after the massacre in Damascus. The United States reached out to Iran. An initial agreement was signed on Iran's nuclear program. Iran was making its way back onto the international scene. For Saudi Arabia, the looming threat was unbearable. It doubled its forces on the Syrian front line and stopped confining its funding to moderated groups.
Do the Saudis recognize that some of the groups they support in Syria are extremists? Yes, but they've made the decision that those are the only people on the battlefield and they're going to prop them up. It's very, very dangerous.
Now more than ever, funding jihad may prove to be a lethal trap for Saudi Arabia because it no longer has a monopoly over the radical movement. The Islamic State also claims to follow Salafist ideology, and the Sauds are its enemies. The group has encouraged an insurgency of the Saudi people.
سلوا سيوفكم اضربوا أعناقهم قطعوا أوصالهم عليكم بهم فإن الله ناصركم بإذنه وحده وإن جندنا لهم الغالبون.
Ça leur fout une véritable pression. Et c'est dans ce cadre-là que on entend parler depuis plusieurs années d'une sorte de revirement encore plus conservateur du royaume saoudien. L'emprisonnement d'intellectuels et de militants, l'exécution d'islamistes, le discours anti-chiite, tout cela s'inscrit en partie dans une politique de surenchère entre l'Arabie saoudite et l'État islamique, qui est le plus orthodoxe.
As a result of this, the blogger Raif Badawi was condemned to 1,000 lashings and 10 years in prison for blasphemy. From that moment on, within the kingdom, anybody who didn't believe in God was condemned for terrorism. The royal family wanted to seem beyond reproach on the religious front. In order to protect their authority, they'd have to be as radical as the most radical out there.
Saudi Arabia is not the enemy, but it's not the solution to the problem either. It's a delicate and difficult balancing act for the West. The last thing we want to see is the House of Saud replaced by Al-Qaeda. At the same time, we don't want the House of Saud to continue to be the principal funder of mosques and madrasas that provide the petri dish in which Al-Qaeda thrives. That's a very difficult balance to make. That's a very difficult conversation to have with an 80-year-old king.
According to King Salman, the Islamic State is likely to disappear. Many countries have already promised to wipe it out. Iran, however, is an historic enemy, and its influence will only grow greater. It must be contained at all costs. In early 2015, King Salman gathered a coalition of Sunni countries and bombarded Yemen. He was convinced that Iran was supporting a rebel group that had just taken hold of the capital. For the first time in its history, Saudi Arabia engaged in war.
Alors au départ, il y a eu un vrai soutien populaire, une fierté que l'Arabie saoudite puisse défendre ses intérêts par elle-même, en organisant elle-même une coalition, etc. Il y avait toute une stratégie de communication un peu à l'américaine, des débriefings à chaque sortie aérienne, etc. Et c'est quelque chose de tout à fait nouveau, ils ne sont pas du tout habitués. Il y a un vrai tournant qui s'opère.
The coalition planes hit the poorest country in the region. Its hospitals, its markets, its schools. But Saudi Arabia had got itself stuck. Despite discreet support from its Western allies, they sold Saudi Arabia weapons, refueled their planes, and kept silent about the massacres committed on civil populations. The regional situation had become too chaotic. The West did not want to risk seeing this conflict destabilize the Saudi authorities. It knew that the authorities were vulnerable. The struggle to be Salman's successor had begun, and this succession could shatter the royal family's unity. For more than 60 years, the throne has passed from brother to brother among the 50-odd sons of the kingdom's founder, Ibn Saud. At each succession, the most powerful of all has become king. But Salman is the last of this brotherhood to reach the Saudi throne. After him, everything will have to change. The rules of succession will no longer apply. They will have to choose a king, not from his 50 sons, but rather from Ibn Saud's 500 grandsons.
Ce que tout le monde pressent depuis un moment, c'est que l'une des branches de la famille va s'imposer contre toutes les autres. C'est-à-dire que l'un de ces 50 princes initiaux va être capable d'imposer sa lignée contre la lignée de ses frères. Et c'est pour ça que depuis des années, en fait, la lutte est à couteau tiré en Arabie Saoudite.
The most powerful prince and official successor was Mohammed ben Nayef, Minister of the Interior. But instead of him, King Salman would rather appoint his favourite son, Mohammed ben Salman. He appointed him as Minister of Defence and dismissed important princes in order to make room for him. It was also at this point that his son, who just turned 30, gave him a huge project to reinvent the country's economy. Saudi Arabia embarked on one of the most worrying turning points in its history. The Kingdom of Black Gold was starting to become a country like the others. Several million people were living below the poverty line. 1 in 3 young people were unemployed. The state still employed 70% of the population, but it had run out of resources. Oil prices had plummeted, and the Saudi population had been doubling every 20 years. Today, the authorities are preparing to introduce taxes. This is a symbol, the sign that the Saudi dream is over.
هل ينجح ولي العهد وولي العهد في فترة بقاء الملك سلمان في تقديم أنفسهم كقادة كبار قادرين على تجاوز المشاكل الكبيرة والتأسيس لعصر جديد؟ أعتقد هذا هو التحدي الكبير القادم.
Saudi Arabia still has another card to play. The royal family has announced the sale of part of Aramco, its oil company. Using the resulting benefits, or $2,000 billion, it can now become the biggest investor in the world and rebuild its fortune by buying back its shares in foreign companies. The West hopes to benefit from this financial windfall too. There is no doubt a lot to be said for remaining friends with Saudi Arabia. But above all, there is a lot at stake if you turn your back on the Sauds. No leader within the region has been as loyal. Nowadays, beyond Saudi Arabia, the West must surely be aware that it has no other significant allies on which it can depend in the Middle East.